Russell, great to meet you.
Yes, hi, Andrew.
I've always heard about you, but we've never actually met. So thank you for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
For the benefit of our audience, could you just perhaps start by explaining who you are, what you get up to, a bit about your background?
Yeah, I guess so. A few hats. Traditionally an estate agent. So my grandfather was an estate agent. My father was an estate agent, believe it or not. So I guess I had no choice but to follow in the family footsteps. So I've done a number of traditional estate agency jobs. I founded a business called eMove, which was one of the first online estate agency businesses. Which before, underneath in the comments in a second, I'm reminded that business failed, but hey, if you don't have a good go, and all that. And I have been a counsellor, and in a property sense was the chairman of a planning committee for a number of years. So obviously I've had some experience of the public sector side of things. Sure. And when the eMove business failed, one of the successes of that failure, if you like, one of the things that came out of that was
kind of carving the way, wasn't it? It was very early doors.
I mean, we were very early, so we were way before ProperPR, of course, who are probably the most famous online estate agency business. We launched in 2009, and there were one or two of us. By the time when we'd finished making lots of noise and raised lots of money, by the time that we were really starting to get traction, the industry, that sector, had attracted about 50 other competitors. So it was almost a victim of its own success.
Yeah.
And although it got to about 8 to 10% market share of all properties listed as a sector, not just eMove, but as a sector, it was just dominated. It was way too competitive. Yeah. So basically, all of them have failed, apart from, I think, Yopa. I think Yopa is probably the only one left.
It reminds me of my history of home finding, because I was one of the very first home finders, and people said that will never work, never take off, and now there are hundreds of them.
Well, and that deserves to be even more successful than it is now, I think. I mean, you look at the States and Europe, I mean, it's a massive part of the sector. Maybe kind of the British homeowner hasn't quite got it yet. So maybe I think the problem is, Phil, we can all end up being a bit before our time, can't we? So anyway, so did that. One of the successes, one of the things that really worked at eMove was PR. We did our own PR, did it in-house. I brought in a guy, a genius actually, by the name of James Lockett, who at the age of 25 was running my PR department with me. And when it failed, I looked at him literally the day after that failure and said, should we set up a PR firm? And he said, yeah, go on, let's do that. Okay. And that was 5 years ago, haven't looked back. So now we are a property-focused PR firm called ProperPR, and that's predominantly what I do, although I do some media stuff as well. So I do some political and property commentary for various broadcast channels.
Good. Russell, key reason for asking you along today was because you claim to be able to solve the housing crisis.
It's quite a bold claim.
It is a huge claim. But I have read some of what you've written, and a lot of it chimed with me. So I thought it would be a great opportunity just to have a little chat through about some of the thoughts that you had.
Yeah. I think the first thing to say is we need to look at what the actual problem or problems are within the housing sector in terms of housing supply. Lots of people talk about the planning system, and I would agree it's broken. It's certainly not optimal, but it's not in itself, in my opinion, the problem. The problem starts with politicians, I'm afraid. So politicians that are given the mandate, so whether it's within the Treasury or whether it's the Prime Minister or a succession of housing ministers, of course, which over the last 14 years, I mean, do you and I even know how many there have been, Phil?
No.
19, 20, something like that. We've all lost count, haven't we? None of them with any experience in property, by the way. So it starts with them and their non-understanding of the sector, but also the fact that being politicians, unfortunately, they get political. So they use the property sector, the housing industry,
which is a real vote winner.
Yeah, well, they use it as a political football.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that football gets kicked and then forgotten about. So the headlines that are made are all great. Yes. Daily Mail, Daily Express, Daily Mirror says ex-housing minister is going to solve the housing crisis by putting money here or by regenerating there. Yeah. They're headlines. It's rhetoric. And if we actually went back over the last 10, even 20 or 30 years and said, OK, let's grab all those headlines and see if any of them actually came true, the vast majority have literally just disappeared into the ether. So the problem is politicians.
It's always occurred to me that politics is quite short term.
Yes.
But the housing system and the process, and indeed the crisis that we're in now, that's long term. That's been created over 25, 30 years.
Exactly right. It's completely out of sync, isn't it? So I think to solve the housing crisis will take 10 years, even if the adoption, the approach that I would suggest is utilised. But of course, governments are 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And housing ministers last, as we've said, ministers last barely a year.
So what do we do?
And the problem, of course, then is a housing minister that could solve the housing crisis today doesn't want to, because he knows the credit won't be given until 3, 4, 5 years down the line, by which time he's either out of politics or somebody else has definitely got his job. And I say that without mentioning any names. I've had that thrown back at me by members of Parliament that I've talked about housing to. Members of Parliament that I know very well have said, yeah, but I won't get the credit. And you think, wow, so our success in terms of housing supply and solving the housing crisis is really at the hands of a bunch of individuals that see ego as the most important thing.
You're depressing me now.
I know, but look, I'm just telling you how it is, right? This is why it's never been solved. We haven't built enough houses in Britain since the Macmillan government, 1960-something.
And I really don't see that changing. Well, but as you say, there are plenty of other issues apart from the...
Well, there are. Look, the other problems, so apart from it not being planning, apart from one of the big problems is that politicians, if you like, get in the way. Yeah. The other problem, the problem that doesn't exist is a question of lack of land. So you and I well know that, 8, 9, 10% of Britain is built on. That's all. So, and bearing in mind, I'm not now going to start suggesting we build on national parks and play areas, and I'm not going to suggest that. But the question of land availability is also not the problem. So I just want to get out there what the problem really is and what the fake problems are not. Right. So we've dealt with those aspects. The problem, and I say this with caution because I have no truck with them, but the problem is the top 10 house builders. Now, I'm not saying they do a bad job, and I'm not disparaging them, and I don't blame them, but think about this for a second. So the top 10 house builders are responsible for something between 70 and 80% of all residential property development in Britain. So the big ones like Persimmon and Bovis, Bellway, Taylor Whip, etc. All good people, all generally publicly listed businesses. So guess who they're beholden to?
Shareholders.
Exactly. Shareholders, not society. So again, I'll say again, I don't blame them.
Yes.
But when they have land banked, 600,000 to 700,000 plots, but they only need to sell 15,000 homes a year to make big money.
So this is between the top 10?
Yes, yeah. So when they only need to, and the biggest only sell about 15,000, right? The likes of Persimmon, all the way down to the smaller guys in that top 10 that might only be producing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 units a year. So they don't need to sell an abundance of homes, often because they've bought the land, got planning permission, they've seen the planning uplift and so on.
Yeah.
Now,
so they've got that as an asset on their balance sheets, presumably, that land.
Yes, however they revalue it, right? And look, let's be clear, these businesses are worth billions and billions of pounds. And I think they should be, right? Again, I have no truck with that. But if you allow almost the entire output, not just of what we would call retail housing, so, housing for resale, but also the associated affordable and social housing by way of Section 106 agreements, if you allow all of that to be at the behest of 10 companies, and let's say they only want to build 100,000 homes a year, and we need 300,000 homes a year, well, then there's a gap, isn't there? The other problem comes, as we saw in 2023, is when there's a downturn in the market, not a crash, by the way, but the downturn that there was in 2023, and a loss of confidence, those developers then, those house builders, understandably say, well, actually, we don't want to sell at 95% of value, so we won't sell as many houses in 2023, which means they market even fewer homes. Yeah. So I guess what I'm setting out is that accidentally what we've allowed to happen is almost the entirety of UK housing supply to be at the behest of the shareholders of 10 companies.
Okay.
What do we expect to happen?
So what are we going to do about it, Ross?
Okay, right. So we set out that. I know I've laboured it, Phil, sorry. So what we need to do is get the politicians out of the way. And we also need to ensure that the house builders, let's just say, have some competition.
Okay.
And I think... Go on.
I've read about you talking about a housing czar.
Well, I think there needs to be someone in charge of housing that is not political, someone that is given a responsibility.
Could it be similar when interest rates were removed and removed from the politicians and given to the Bank of England? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
What I'm suggesting is that a national house building corporation is set up. So hopefully we're all too young to remember this, but at the end of the Second World War, new town development corporations were set up to create the likes of Milton Keynes, Harlow and Basildon. And they had a mandate. And that mandate was, there's the land. This is how many homes we need to build over the next 10 years. Now devise a strategy in terms of, the what, the where and the how and the when, and get on with it, unfettered by political interference. We need to do that on a national level. So what I suggest, what I recommend, is that we start a National House Building Corporation, which is run by people with property experience, whether it be the former CEO of Taylor Wimpey and the former CFO of Bovis or whatever. Yeah. It's owned by the taxpayer, so there'll be civil servants involved and politicians by way of steering, by way of the board. But the assembled board then put together a strategy for housing supply across the country. Now, it doesn't take that much to work out what housing is needed where, both in terms of retail housing, social housing and affordable housing. It's based on local economy strength, it's based on population growth and so on. And you can engineer it to an extent, the whole levelling up thing. You can try to promote other areas of the country perhaps, but obviously then you need infrastructure by way of commerce there as well. But anyway, the other ingredient that is important here is publicly owned land. Now, there's about 180,000 hectares in Britain of land that is owned by the public, which obviously is looked after by the likes of local authorities, national government and so on. So as an example,
what's on that land today?
So as an example, 6,000 Ministry of Defence homes are currently empty. So 6,000 homes are empty, owned by the Ministry of Defence. Yeah. They will argue, but we need those for transitioning, whatever, people in and out. National Health Service land. Rail land.
Well, why would the National Health Service be owning large slices?
Well, because when they originally build a hospital and they buy land, they don't use all of it. There's surplus land. But the biggest problem is with local authorities. Now, when I was a councillor in Brentwood in Essex up to 2015, I was given the task by the then leader of the council, Brandon Lewis, who's now Sir Brandon Lewis, an MP. He said, can you take a look at the assets of Brentwood, the stuff we own, and kind of work out a plan? And honestly, I was horrified when I looked into the assets of just that one small borough, one of 400 in the country, let's say. And first of all, it was evident that we owned lots of land per se. It was also very evident that we owned lots of land that we didn't know we owned. Seriously. And there were deeds in boxes behind doors up in the attic and all sorts. So anyway, there should be now an asset register for local authorities and national government to actually show what they own. Because that isn't
That can't
clear.
be that difficult.
Well, it shouldn't be, but lots of authorities have not done that. What is then clear is that local authorities, government departments and so on, believe me, there are swathes of government-owned, publicly owned land that could be built on. So if you can put those two things together, so you create a working document that shows where the demand is. Then you go to those areas and find the public land that's already existing. And then you marry the two things up. And you do that as part of a strategy to decide, so again, using Brentwood as an example, let's say that town needs 1,000 new homes over, per year over the next 10 years. Well, that's 10,000 homes. You find the land, you work out very cleverly what those housing tenures need to be. So the mix of house types, the mix of housing tenures. You then lay that out in a strategy that gets signed off by the board. But then that entity, that house building corporation, is allowed to get on with it
and build it themselves.
Well, yes, but using builders. I mean, let's be honest. Most big builders use contractors. Lots of them do. So because you've got the expertise then within that business, within that board, if you like, you can then bring in subcontractors to build homes. Now, what you then end up with, of course, is this mix, let's say per acre, of 20 properties being built. Some of them get sold for profit. Some of them are retained as affordable stroke social housing. So some of it will be shared ownership. Some of it will be social rent. You're then creating an uplift in value by way of the properties that are sold, which then goes back into the pot, which pays for the initial house building. So when you actually game this out over 5 or 10 years, what actually happens is this makes a significant amount of money. So it becomes self-funding.
Have you modelled this through?
I have. I mean, I'm not a mathematician. But yes, on the basis that if you've got some, let's call it fallow land in your local authority area that currently doesn't have planning permission and it's sat in public ownership for 30 or 40 years and all of a sudden it gets planning permission appropriately, I'm not talking about forcing any, undemocratic process on anybody here. But of course, the uplift, as we know, in terms of the land value is significant. So you then realise that uplift, but use that huge margin between arable land or whatever it is at 3,000 an acre versus land that can be developed worth £1 million an acre. That then all goes back into the pot. The whole thing is not just self-funding. It makes money. So not only, I mean, get this, I know this is another bold statement, not only do you solve the housing crisis, you create benefit for society because you have the right properties in the right place, and you put money back into the government coffers.
You make it all sound so straightforward.
It works. The only reason this hasn't been adopted, and I've shown it to MPs on both sides of the parliamentary aisle, I spoke about this at the Labour Party conference a few years ago, because there is no credit to be given to an individual, in my opinion, that is why this does not fly. Yeah. I would love, seriously, I mean, you and I, to go to the House of Commons and say, guys, whoever's in power in a few months' time, you've got to at least look at this, because, and I'm not suggesting it's easy, but it is a fairly simple thing to do based on the fact we have the land, we have the ability, and we have a crisis to solve. We have a crisis.
And we are where we are because of short-term policies.
Exactly that. And that's what I'm seeking to get us around. And actually, it's not... I mean, I remember standing up in the council chamber once talking about this sort of thing, and I was accused by a fellow Conservative councillor of being a socialist, as if I want to nationalise housing nationally. This isn't nationalising. This is utilising land that's owned by the public for good use. I'm not suggesting that we close down Persimmon, Bellway, Bovis.
No, because they'll carry on doing what they do on land that they own or buy.
Exactly right. But what this does is to fill in the gap. And I think this could create 100,000 new homes a year, but to be clear, of mixed tenure. Yeah. So it's not just big houses for millionaires. This is one-bedroom shared ownership flats. This is council-type flats, because there needs to be a mix.
Can we talk a bit about stamp duty? Because I know you've got some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. A tax that goes back to about the 16th century, doesn't it? I think that's the origins of stamp duty. First introduced to fund a war on France. Now, I know
is that right?
I know we've just Brexited, but I don't think we need to worry about that anymore. I don't think we go to war with President Macron anytime soon. 1997, Gordon Brown enters number 11 Downing Street, and he is the recipient of about £1 billion a year in stamp duty revenue. By the time he's finished, and actually accentuated by George Osborne and others since, the take for the Exchequer for stamp duty now is £15 billion per annum.
And it's such an easy tax to collect.
It is, but it's a tax on aspiration, isn't it? I think, and it's a tax on the southeast, because of course houses are more expensive in the southeast. I've toyed with what the government should do, and I think it's very easy. You know, when you look at the trade press, you look at commentators in the Negotiator and Estate Agents Today and Property Industry Eye, they say, well, I think it should be scrapped. Well, okay, fine. It's a lovely, easy thing to say, but how do you then say to the Exchequer, right, you can replace it with X?
Yes.
Because £15 billion is quite a lot of money at the moment. So do you make it beholden on the seller that's made the profit, perhaps? I think that's one argument, that the seller should pay. I think there needs to be a consideration for downsizers, because I think there's a huge number of downsizers that aren't downsizing
100%,
because they've got to pay a fortune in stamp duty. Or do you turn to what other countries have done, which is to tax people, if you must, I guess we have to, based on property value on an ongoing basis. So a reversion of council tax. Well, not mansion tax, but just, a tax on value, but you do it on an annual basis rather than on purchase or sale. The big issue I have with it, apart from the fact that it's gone up 15-fold over the number of years, is just the fact, and the fact that it's a tax on aspiration. It's a tax that you pay on earnings that you've accrued, that you've already paid tax on.
Yeah.
I do think it's regressive.
What about first-time buyers? It always seemed to me a cruel tax on first-time buyers.
Well, they're off the hook to an extent, aren't they? Of course, so they don't pay first. They don't pay up to £400,000, which in most parts of the country goes off the hook. There are, of course, rumours. I mean, I don't know if this will happen, but in the autumn statement that might be the precursor to the general election that's coming, there are rumours that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, as we're recording this, he might not be later, he is thinking about changing stamp duty. Now, whether that's thresholds or whether that's the entire mechanism, I don't know, to make it fairer. And I suspect if he does that, he's not going to do that as a benefit to people in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 million pound houses, is he? He's going to do it probably for the benefit of first-time buyers. So maybe we'll see that threshold increase. But I do think
it's tinkering.
Yeah, it's tinkering, and I think there needs to be a better way of doing it. Because it chokes the property market. It definitely stops people moving, particularly at the top end. And of course, look, as we know, depending on no matter what part of the political spectrum that you support, if one part of the property sector is not working very well, then it affects the rest. So if first-time buyers are, in some way dissuaded, then that affects the top end. If the top end is dissuaded, then there's a trickle down. So I think we need to come up with a mechanism that is fairer and more transparent, and actually not quite as stepped as it is. The fact that some people pay 2% stamp duty, but if you're a foreign buyer in London with a second home, your marginal rate now is 18% stamp duty. That seems absolutely outrageous to me, absolutely abhorrent. And by the way, for those saying, well, but we need to deter foreign buyers, be careful what you wish for, because in some parts of the country, foreign buyers make up such a huge part of the purchase demand that if you got rid of them altogether, you would see local markets collapsing. So I think we need to be careful what we wish for.
Should we talk about another form of tax, the tax relief for landlords, and how that, there isn't tax relief for landlords anymore, and how that is affecting the rental market, and indeed what that looks like for society going forward?
Yeah, tax relief and rental reform, I guess. I think it's true to say that landlords over the last few years have been kicked pretty hard, I think, by government. I think being a landlord is still a lucrative thing because you'll still have capital appreciation. And of course, rightly or wrongly, we've seen huge rent increases over the last 2 or 3 years. So their yields have increased. But I think
but why is that? It's
lack of supply. Lack of supply.
Because of the tax that's been...
but it's not the landlord's fault. I mean, I almost feel that the government, again, to make a headline, it's very easy to trash landlords. And there, of course, and I'll tread carefully here, there are some tenant reform groups here that see landlords as the Antichrist. I've been at the likes of the National Investor Landlord Show and the Property Investor Show and come out to tenant protests saying, landlords are evil, landlords are terrible. And my question to them is, what will you do without them? Yeah,
we do need a system that works for landlords and tenants.
But
it's
again,
got to be attractive for landlords.
But it's not as simple as saying either let's allow the public sector to create all the housing stock, because we know over the last 40 or 50 years, as you and I have just rehearsed, the government don't supply adequate housing, right? So the landlords have to fill in the gap. Most landlords are not big, nasty corporates. They are people, couples, that have used their savings to buy 1 or 2 properties. And I know you know this, but just for those watching. And they're just trying to earn an honest living. 99% are good people. They create good homes and they look after those properties. If you end up in a situation where you ostracise landlords too much, either through taking away their tax relief on mortgage and so on, or through saying we think tenants should be able to literally come and go as a revolving door in your home whenever they see fit, well, you will then see, as is happening, I think. I mean, there was some data very recently.
I think it is happening.
2,000 landlords a month are leaving the sector. That creates a greater shortage. Now, some will watch this as tenant activists and say, well, that's great, because all those landlord homes can be bought by the people that are tenants. Well, that's fantastical, isn't it? Because if those tenants wanted to buy a property, they'd be buying one of the 300,000 homes on Rightmove, Zoopla on the market today, wouldn't they? Not every tenant has a deposit. Not every tenant can afford a mortgage. Not every tenant wants to own a home. So it's not as simple as saying landlords are taking properties away from tenants being owners. That's simply not true. So I think, again, it's just another example of governments being out of step with the market and, again, not understanding their brief. I think the rental reform debacle has been an absolute farce over the last 3 or 4 years. You've got the likes of Ben Beadle from the National Residential Landlords Authority, who's almost single-handedly been fighting for landlords to try and make that act better. The answer, I think, is do something with the short-hold tenancy agreements. So instead of them being 12-month holiday lets, which is effectively what they are, you allow a German-type system where a landlord and a tenant, like you and I, let's say you're my landlord, I'm the tenant, And you say, well, how long do you want to live here for, Russ? And I say, well, do you know what, Phil?
10 years.
10 years, is that okay? Yeah, well, I'll tell you what we'll do then. Let's write in a CPI uplift in rent every year. Is that okay? Could be good, could be bad. And a break clause at 5 years.
Gives the tenants security. They put the roots down on the community. They probably renovate the kitchen.
Put their kids through the same school, knowing they've got security and tenure. And then you don't have to worry about rental reform acts.
It would make lending easier, wouldn't it? Surely the mortgage companies would like it.
Phil, in the last 15 or 20 minutes, you and I have solved the housing crisis. And we've solved the conundrum of landlord versus tenant.
You are the housing czar.
Well, I might be a bit too outspoken, I think, for politics, unfortunately. But I do hope whoever is in government next, whether it's the current lot or the new lot, as it's probably going to be, they just listen to people, listen to the industry, listen to the sector. Don't solve a problem that doesn't exist. And stop trying to make headlines for the sake of headlines, because, as we've said, that simply doesn't fix anything.
We need long-term policies to sort this out.
Yeah.
Russell, great to talk to you.
And you.
Thank you so much. I'm committed to supporting you and answering your property questions with valuable content. There's a lot to cover, and with your support, we can make it happen. So if you find our content valuable, I'd be extremely grateful if you could hit the subscribe button. Thank you for being a part of our community.